Welcome to Occult of Personality, esoteric podcast extraordinaire. I'm Greg Kaminsky, and your co-host is Billy Hepper. Now, in episode number 220, you know him, you love him. Freemason, Druid, and author John Michael Greer returns to the show to discuss his recent book, The Ceremony of the Grail, Ancient Mysteries, Gnostic Heresies, and the Lost Rituals of Freemasonry. From start to finish, this interview is totally lit. John Michael Greer has more fully revealed some of the most intriguing mysteries of Western esotericism, which for me include Gnostic connections to the Grail mythos and the origins of Freemasonry. To be honest, I never actually thought I would encounter proof that is so clear and was more than willing to accept understandings without it. But this is next level in terms of the history of Western esotericism. Highly, highly recommended. The Ceremony of the Grail is a must-read, along with Greer's book on temple technology, The Secret of the Temple, Earth Energy's Sacred Geometry, and the Lost Keys of Freemasonry. Occult of Personality podcast is made possible by you, the listeners, and by the subscribers to chamberofreflection.com, our membership website, who aids us in the cause of informed, authentic, and accessible interviews about Western esotericism. Thank you again. Because of your support, we're able to bring you recordings of this caliber and many more to come. The intro music is Awakening by Paul Avgerinos, and the outro music is The Holy Grail by Russ Hopkins and Jerry Palmer. Hello.
Hello, John.
Yeah.
Good to speak with you again.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us again. I really, really appreciate it. It's always good to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. It's free publicity for me. You know, what's not to like?
Indeed, and we get to listen to you talk about your awesome research and writing, so it's a great, great deal, I think, on both sides.
Yeah, glad to hear it.
So I guess just want to kick things off by saying how much I enjoyed your book. I love the topic. I found it endlessly interesting to read and consider and think about, and just kind of like keep going back over the material, and it just seems like it keeps unfolding. So I know you allude to that in a little bit in your book, but I just want to say thank you. And that I'm sure Billy has things he would like to say along those lines as well.
Yeah, just wanted to echo that as well. I mean, first of all, just reading the back of your book, the description, I was just struck of how you managed to somehow combine all of my interests into this single volume. You have,
well, that one covers a lot of my interests, and so the research and reading that went into that goes literally back into my early teens.
Wow. Okay.
So it's one of those. It's something I've been working on for a long time.
That's great. Yeah, you managed to pack a lot in there. The Grail mysteries, Templar rituals, Freemasonry, sacred architecture, just everything is just great. So suffice to say, I devoured this book at record speed, which is always a sign that I really liked it and found it difficult to put down. In fact, it was written.
That's always great for an author to hear.
Yeah, I just found it was written in such a accessible style as well, which I appreciated, because so many books on the Grail have this kind of cryptic, kind of pretentious style. But I just found the pacing and the length of the book just perfect. I mean, you managed to just pack a lot into this book. So
I learned a lot by going back to my original love of fiction and writing a bunch of novels. You learn some things about writing by doing that. And I think I've tried to apply that to my nonfiction as well.
Yeah, I can imagine. So yeah, just wanted to congratulate you, John, on this book. I absolutely love it. I absolutely recommend it to our listeners. I actually read it twice over my Christmas holidays just to absorb it all.
Okay,
yeah.
Cool.
Just curious, what made you decide that this was the right time to write a book on the Grail?
Well, I'd had the project in mind for a long time, and had been just piecing things together. After I finished the specific research that resulted in my earlier book, The Secret of the Temple, I knew that really doing something focused on the Grail myth was going to be the next project along those lines. But I knew I had a lot of reading and study to do, and so it kind of went from there. The material in Secret of the Temple is, I mean, you don't have to read Secret of the Temple to understand Ceremony of the Grail by any means, but one very much led to the other, because Secret of the Temple, again, the research project that led to that, brought me into the underworld of old Gnostic rituals and some of the very secret traditions that went into the Templars, that went into the Rosicrucians, and so on.
Great. Excellent. Can you tell us a little bit about the sources that you went to when you were doing the research for your new book?
That's a long story. Well, basically, I had the advantage here in that I had been crazy about Arthurian legends, especially about the Grail legend, since my teen years, since my early teen years. About the time I graduated from reading these sort of versions of Arthurian stories for children into actually getting into the scholarship. So I started by rereading a lot of the Grail literature, both the original texts, fortunately, which are pretty much all available in translation these days, and then also the scholarship on the subject. That brought me back to Jessie Weston, who was considered in her time one of the most important scholars of the entire subject, one of the major figures of Grail scholarship, and who has basically been erased from the discussion these days. And it was Jessie Weston ended up being the lens through which I focused what I was doing, and from her, the various leads that she dropped, things that she knew as much about as anyone did at the time. I mean, this was back in the very early 20th century. The Nag Hammadi manuscripts, the Nag Hammadi Library of Gnostic Texts, had not yet been discovered, so there were sharp limits on what we knew about Gnosticism. There was a lot of new stuff that's come out over the recent decades, since her death, about the Holy Grail, about the Templars, all kinds of subjects. So I started with her and just sort of zoomed off in every available angle, and then it started getting weird, because I would run into things more or less at random. Of course, this happens. I mean, I forget who it was suggested that there's a spirit of the bookstore or the spirit of the library that nudges the right book out to you when you need one. But it happens. The entire chapter that I wrote on the debatable land, that weird little region between Scotland and England, the local public library here in East Providence, which it's a very pleasant little library, but it's not a huge research library. They turned up with a book on the subject.
Wow.
Of all things. And I was looking at this going, oh, that looks interesting. And I didn't even connect it with the Grail originally. I just saw this book about this little region that was back in the day, was neither part of England nor part of Scotland, but this little separate zone. And thought, wow, that's interesting. I should read it. And then realized by about chapter 3, I know where we are. I know what's going on here. Connected it to the Merlin legends, connected it to material I'd read about the early Dark Ages in the north of Britain and southern Scotland, and started realizing that it was actually one of the keys to the whole riddle. Connected that to some of the material that Jessie Weston wrote about the long-term survival of the Grail ritual in northern Britain, and away we went. So it was a long and winding road. Everything in the bibliography was something that I had to dig my way through. Sometimes with a great deal of pleasure, sometimes as when I was reading Arthur Edward Waite, going, oh God, how much of this is left? But
yes.
Waite, I shouldn't be as sarcastic toward him as I am, but I am. He was a dreadful writer.
Yes, I second that.
One thing I do have to say, he's a better writer than he is a poet. You can find his poetry nowadays if you really, really want to.
Fair enough. Okay. I struggled through his hidden Church of the Holy Grail. I got about, I made a supreme effort to get through that in my early years, but it's a struggle.
And why? And he's doing all of it because that was the tackiest sort of bait and switch. The hidden Church of the Holy Grail. What is it? Why? It's ordinary Christianity, just a little more serious and profound. Everything in Arthur Edward Waite's Cosmos came down to how can I convince people to embrace Jesus. which is fine, but it gets dull.
Yeah. He does put copious amounts of research into his work, though. I mean, his notes are extensive for sure.
His notes are extensive, but you have to read them knowing that he has his agenda, and because there, as I noted in my book, there are places where he literally falsifies information, where he says things that not only are not true, but that he had every reason to know were not true.
Yeah.
Because everything has to be subordinate to the goal of dragging souls to Christ, and apparently telling little white lies was not a problem for him.
Yeah, he definitely had his own agenda going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you, John.
I want to, I guess, start with some just basic questions, which maybe don't have some as simple answers, but could you talk a little bit about what is the Grail and whom does the Grail serve?
Oh yeah, little bitty questions. Those are two of the three questions that the Grail Knight in the different legends would have to say when he got to the Grail Castle. He'd sit down, there'd be a banquet, and in total silence, the Grail procession would go past him, and then he has to ask the question. And some of them is, "What is this? What is the Grail?" In some of them, it's, "Whom does the Grail serve?" And in some of that, you turn to the Fisher King and say, "What ails you? What's wrong with you?" You have to ask those questions. What is the Grail? The Grail is a lot of different things. One of the French writers has 5 different changes, of which most are not described. Some people call it a cup. Some people call it a stone. Some people it's a platter with a decapitated head on it. The Grail is a symbol. It's a way of talking about several things, and in typical esoteric fashion, they're sort of collapsed in on each other, so you can use the term with more than one label. In the Corpus Hermeticum, the book of the writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus out of Hellenistic Egypt, the crater, the cup, the Grail is the source of nous, of the enlightened mind, and so it's like the Vajra or diamond in Tibetan Buddhism. It's the goal of enlightenment. It's also, in another sense, as I argue, and this is one of the points that I made in Secret of the Temple, it is an archaic technology, a way of using natural forces to generate improved agricultural yields through certain specific kinds of structures that were built and tuned and positioned in a very specific way to draw on terrestrial energy currents on the one hand, and to do things involving low-intensity microwaves on the other. So you see, what is the Grail? The Grail is a category. It is an emblem. It is something that can be unpacked and interpreted in many ways. Whom does the Grail serve? None of our texts mention that. The question is asked. It's never answered. I think it's like a koan in Zen. You're given this question that has no logical answer. You have to answer it by rising to a different level of awareness. So, whom does the Grail serve? Maybe it serves all of us. That was one of the things that Arthur Edward messed with, by the way. He insisted that, no, it's who serves the Grail. Because, of course, the Grail for him is Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Which is fine. Which is fine if you happen to be a mystical Christian, but many of us aren't. Go on.
I was under the impression, I could be wrong, as I often am, that there were sort of 3 levels of the sort of Gnostic understanding of the human beings, and that the Grail served the ones who were the spiritual ones. But that could be just my preference.
No, one of the things you find in many of the Gnostic traditions is this idea that there are 3 basic classes of humanity. There are the hylics, or material people, who exist purely on the physical level. There are the psychics, or mental people, who can think. And you have the pneumatics or spiritual people who can actually attune themselves to the gnosis, who can achieve that recognition which is beyond reasoning thought. One of the things that really interested me about the specific branch of the Gnostic movement that seems to have resulted in the ceremony of the Grail, that seems to have been part of that whole tradition, the Naascenes, is that they felt that Gnosis could be extended to all three in different ways. And so there's a particular mode of initiation for the Hylics, for the material people. There's a particular mode for the psychics and a particular mode for the pneumatics, and each one is appropriate for, whatever station of being you happen to be in. And so, to some extent, whom does the Grail serve? Well, is it the Grail as a fertility symbol? That's the material-minded thing. Is it the Grail as this tradition, this body of wisdom and lore? That's for the psychics. Is it the Grail as enlightenment? That's for the pneumatics.
Thank you.
That makes a lot of sense. And you touched on something earlier that I just wanted to circle back to, if you didn't mind. This whole idea of the Grail as this sort of means to transmit this ancient technology, what you describe as this kind of archaic folk technology that was really developed over trial and error over, thousands of years. And, the end goal of this was, of course, improving the crop yields by using these, specially designed structures as this sort of resonating chamber to amplify certain earth energies. And we know that all over the world, specific kinds of religious architecture are traditionally associated with agricultural plenty and abundance. And you cite several good examples in your book, like, the Temple of King Solomon, that sort of thing. Can you just tell us a little bit more about this phenomenon? Because I just found it absolutely fascinating, and also how this temple technology might sort of fit into the Grail legends.
Okay, sure. I'll start by talking about what led me there, how I got this insight into the temple technology. It was actually by way of the Temple of Solomon. I'm a Freemason, as I think most readers know, right. And the rituals of Freemasonry, most of them revolve around the Temple of Solomon, about its construction, about its destruction and rebuilding. All these, they're basically every detail in the history of the temple, from the time of King David through to the Knights Templar, has a place in Masonic ritual. And of course that got me thinking, okay, why the Temple of Solomon? There are historical reasons why that should have been a temple of great interest, obviously, to a religious tradition descended from Judaism. But what is special about this temple? So I started doing some research into it, and I found all of these references in the Talmud, in other Jewish sources, in Jewish folklore and legend, that when the temple was intact, the crops blossomed. Agricultural abundance and plenty was much greater. In fact, it's one of the Ezra, I think, one of the last books of the Old Testament. I think might be Nehemiah. They're saying, you know perfectly well that before stone was put on stone in the rebuilding of the temple, you know what kind of bad crop yields you have, and now it's much better. And I was going, hold it. Because of course that kind of thing appears in folklore and legend all over the place. Right. You have these ideas that if you build a temple and make the right kind of offerings and the right kind of ceremonies to the gods will respond with abundance. And of course, that got me thinking of what Jessie Weston said about the Grail as a sort of talisman of fertility and abundance. And I started, you can see the sort of pieces drifting together. So I started looking into that subject, and began to piece together the idea that it's possible that, in fact, using very simple technological means some of which have been reverse engineered at this point, it's possible to boost agricultural fertility quite considerably by harnessing some of these earth energies, and we're not talking necessarily something woo-woo here. Again, telluric electricity, there are electric currents and magnetic flows that move through the actual physical substance of the earth. You can concentrate and direct those, and they have biological effects. Right. And so that before the the fertilizer industry basically took control of agriculture in most of the developed world. There was an entire field of study called electroculture, where people were literally running weak electric currents through the fields and finding out that it caused a sharp increase in plant growth. You can still find old books on electroculture in online archives and so on. So I was piecing this stuff together. I am still not entirely sure of the details. It is an ongoing quest. One of my readers suggested not long ago that there's some evidence that what's going on is literally a low-energy maser. A maser is a microwave laser. It basically causes coherent emission of microwaves. And you could do it by, certain kinds of magnetic fields, certain kinds of other things in an atmosphere that's full of volatile aromatic compounds. We call those incense nowadays, I think. And so I'm following this one up right now. I have a lot more work to do, and there will be further books, but it seems at least possible that, people many, many thousands of years ago stumbled on the basic principle of a technology that would boost, crop fertility. I'm sure their interpretation of it was precisely that, if you do these things in exactly this way, the gods are pleased. And they give you good crops. They were not approaching this as modern physicists, but they could put two and two together. They were saying, okay, this temple does better than that temple. This shrine has more effects than that shrine. What are the differences? So you end up with the geometrical factors giving a better resonance chamber. You end up with different kinds of incense, huge amounts of frankincense. Frankincense was one of the major imports of the Roman Empire. They imported in by the ton from from the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa, which is where it grows. And that was the incense that you used all through the Roman world. They had a lot of other potential incenses. Why did they fixate on that one? I have a suggestion. But so all of this this was the raw material out of which I developed my thesis, out of which I developed the book, The Secret of the Temple. And the Grail was one of the things that showed up there, because I was looking at, okay, we have, a secret of fertility. What does the Grail do? When the Grail, when something goes wrong with the Grail, you have the wasteland.
Right.
No trees grow, no water flow, not even a blade of grass. And when you ask the right question, and the powers of the Grail are reawakened, then all of a sudden the wasteland becomes green. It's pretty obvious what they're saying here. What uses this thing? Understand, ask the right questions about this thing, this tradition, this whatever, and the land becomes green. And so that led me into looking, okay, what is the Grail? What are the things, what are the various symbols that are used for the Grail, the interpretations of the Grail? One of the things that the Grail was in the Middle Ages was the temple technology. It was their way of talking about it at a time when symbolism was a very widely used language and one that most people could interpret. So that's kind of how all that ties together.
Right. It also reminded me, you only need to look at the great cathedrals in Europe and ancient Christian churches, and you see these wonderful agricultural motifs, carved everywhere in the stone, painted on the ceilings. You see this explosion of, grapevines and corn and wheat and fruit blossoming everywhere, this explosion of life and abundance. And I think that's very intentional. Those themes are there to remind us of this link between the temple architecture and the land itself.
Yeah, the Gothic cathedrals are particularly important because those started being built after the Knights Templar were established, after the Knights Templar found whatever they found under the Temple Mount. Right. I argue that one of the things they located, whether there or simply from whichever Gnostic sect they contacted in the Holy Land, was information about the temple technology. And so you see the transformation from Romanesque architecture, which the pre-Gothic, rather heavy, but potentially still functional approach to the temple technology. You have the Gothic comes in. You have this explosion, as you say, of vegetative motifs. You have these. You're walking down the aisle of a church, and it looks like you're in a forest with all these stone tree trunks rising up and branching above you.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I have a bit of a follow-up question, if you don't mind.
Sure. Ask
In
me
your
anything.
in your book, you managed to quite succinctly make a case to connect up three things that might not seem remotely related on the surface. You have this temple technology that we've been talking about. Then you have the stories of the Grail, and then you have this secret initiation ritual, which comes down from the mystery cults of the ancient Greek and Roman world. The cults of Mithras and that sort of thing. And the armchair historian in me kind of scratches my head at first, like how could these mysteries come over from the Mediterranean world and make their way all the way over to Britain and France? But the answer is, of course, with the Roman legionaries, who we know were very involved in bringing these mysteries with them wherever they traveled. As you said, when the legions left Britain, these mystery traditions remained behind. They were practiced, they were preserved in various forms. So it's a fascinating thesis in my mind. Could you just fill us in a little bit more on that?
Okay, let's start with the ancient mysteries. We don't know anything like enough about them. There's been some very good scholarship over the last 200 years trying to tease out what was done. There are various theories and hypotheses about what actually took place. But one thing we know absolutely for a fact is that most of them had to do with agricultural fertility. Think of the Eleusinian mysteries. This is the most famous set of mystery rituals in the ancient world, originally practiced at Eleusis, just outside of Athens. And it's all about Demeter and Persephone, the great agricultural myth of Greek times. Persephone is the seed. She goes down to Hades. She rises up again. Like you bury the seed and up comes the grain. And Demeter is, of course, the goddess of agriculture. And according to the Greek tradition, it was at Eleusis, at that little town outside of Athens, that the goddess Demeter, who was traveling around the world looking for her daughter, because they treated her so hospitably, and they tried to comfort her in her grief, and so she taught them how to farm. That was where, as far as the Greeks believed, that was where agriculture began, right there. And the mysteries were all tied up in that. So you have that theme of agricultural fertility right there at the core, and you find that in many other mystery traditions, including, please note, Christianity, which started out basically as a mystery cult. I mean, how many people realize the town Bethlehem? In Hebrew, that means the house of bread. Okay, so you have this Savior who's born in Bethlehem, and who is doing all of these miracles involving loaves and fishes and wine, and who finally rises up above the ground to be sacrificed like the head of the barley. It's very much a classic Mediterranean mystery kind of religion, which ended up becoming a world religion of a different kind. But all of these things have this very straightforward connection to agriculture. Now, in the later history of the mysteries, they got a great deal more mystical material. There was we're going to talk about agriculture, but we're also going to talk about human spiritual development. We're going to talk about life after death. We're going to talk about mysticism and meditation. You have, by the time the Neoplatonists get into the act, you have these very rich, complex explanations and understandings of the mystery tradition, but it's all rooted in this basic agricultural concept. Then in come the Gnostics. And most of the Gnostics, of course, as the ones that have gotten all the press recently are the ones who are saying, the material world is evil. We're trapped in this dreadful iron prison, and we must escape to our true homes in the world of light. That's the Johannite approach. That's the sort of generic Nag Hammadi Gnosticism. But you also have these alternative Gnostic views, like the Nicene, who are saying, no, we're here for a reason. And the initiations of matter are also appropriate. The mysteries, the old Greek agricultural mysteries, are the first gate. Regular Christianity to them was the second gate. And then the Gnostic practices are the third gate that actually leads to Gnosis. And so they had this really interesting, sort of three-stage process that incorporated the old mysteries as well as conventional Christian ritual, the Mass and so on. And of course, the mainstream Christian church had cattle. They could not handle that.
Yeah.
But we know that Gnostic groups like that, they were around. They survived. They were good at going underground. We know, they were, of course, all over southern France before the Albigensian Crusade wiped most of them out. They were all over Eastern Europe a century or so, a couple of centuries before that. They kept on popping up here and there because they knew how to keep their mouths shut. And especially ones of the Gnosian variety who considered ordinary Christian ritual to be, again, that second gate. So you can go to church. All through the Middle Ages, many of these Gnostics were going to ordinary church services. They were, hearing the Mass just like their Orthodox neighbors and being perfectly devout and all that. But they also had this first gate of agricultural ritual, and they had the third gate of Gnosis. So you have this sort of continuing process. The Templars got a very heavy dose of that and brought that back with them. One of the charges against the Templars when they were being persecuted and exterminated was that they believed that this Baphomet idol of theirs was what made the plants grow. There we have that same theme. And so you have this sort of structure propagating itself. You have it by way of, the Roman legions, of course, bringing the Mithraic mysteries and many other mystery cults to Britain, to France, and so on. You have then the Templars bringing a Gnosticized version of that. You have various strange things going on in some of the oldest monasteries in Britain and elsewhere. Glastonbury, there were strange things going on in Glastonbury. We don't actually know what all. And then eventually you have by the time this stuff is finally being assembled in the Renaissance and you have the origins of modern Freemasonry, you have people who are trying to piece together all the pieces and are drawing on every scrap of heritage they can get from old writings, from living folk traditions. And so it's not that these things existed in unbroken form. It's that they were constantly being reinvented and pieced back together and preserved and transmitted in various ways and by various channels.
Right. It's a twisting, turning path, but it's fascinating to follow.
Mm-hmm.
And
mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, what were some of the ways that these traditions were preserved, particularly in England? You mentioned even folk dances and that sort of thing.
Oh, yeah. Jessie Weston argued that certain classes of English folk dance were kind of descended from the old mystery cults. They were what happened when you take a mystery ritual and leave it in the popular mind among farming people for about 1,000 years. And I think she makes a very good point. And so you have that. You have specifically the mummer dances, the sword dances, not the Scottish sword dances, but the ones in northern England that sort of symbolically cut someone's head off. Again, you're harvesting the grain. You have rituals in certain crafts. The one that of course everyone brings to mind is Freemasonry, the old rituals of the builders' guilds. And they were people the old builders were the people who absolutely had to know this stuff because, again, they were involved in constructing the medieval churches that used the temple technology. Right. So they had these traditions and material like this. There were probably documentary sources. We don't have any of them in the West. I don't, unfortunately, read Sanskrit or medieval Japanese, or I'd be doing some serious research in those languages, because both Japan and India unquestionably had the temple technology, right. and used it. And well, in both cases, they still use it. Whether they know the technology, the details of the technology or not, the Shinto shrines and Hindu temples are still built using the classic patterns, using all the classic geometries. They probably still generate the same effects. So you have basically it, but it did trickle out. It did get lost in the Western world, at least. So where the ceremony was preserved in one fragmentary form in terms of the sword dances and so on, in another fragmentary form as the Master Mason degree of Freemasonry, in several other ritual formats, and possibly in another one, the ceremony of the Grail itself. The temple technology was lost by 1700 at the latest, and probably before then. And I'm not sure how much of it was preserved even in Asia.
Right. Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. Thank you very much.
John, I'm wondering, could you tell us a little bit about the elucidation
Oh, yes.
And also, when you talk about it, maybe include some of the gematria that's sort of inherent in it and leads back to these Gnostic traditions.
See now. Okay, we'll start with the elucidation. That is far and away the most mysterious of the Grail legends. It is the elucidation. It survives in like 3 copies. It was not a popular thing, but it purports to be. It dates from the 1200s, and it purports to be the real story, what was actually going on behind the Grail legend. Let's see. John and Caitlin Matthews actually recently published a very nice book on the subject called The Secret Book of the Grail, where they give their own translation of it in verse, and they also give their interpretation of it, which is different from mine, but doesn't actually conflict with it. It's worth reading. It tells this very strange story. So once upon a time in the land of Logres, there was this very unusual custom where there were puits, which could mean hills or could mean wells in medieval French. It's spelled the same way, so you can't tell. We'll say hills for a reason that we can get to later. And there were maidens who tended the puits, and who, if you were traveling, you could stop there, and they would feed you. They would bring out, these golden vessels, these golden bowls full of food, and you could get a meal wherever you're traveling. Way up on our idea of fast food, and so. But this was the custom in Logres. It had been the custom in Logres from time out of mind. But then, we have the wicked king Amangons, who, instead of accepting the hospitality of the puits, he stopped at one and he raped the maiden who was tending it and stole her golden bowl. And when word of this got out and nothing dire happened to him instantly, his vassals, who should have, of course, upheld justice and protected the maidens, did the same thing, and they raped the maidens and they stole their bowls. And that was what caused the wasteland, because what they didn't realize is that once they did that, that was the off switch for agricultural fertility in the land of Logres. And so the king Amangons and his wicked vassals all suffered a dreadful fate, not specified. And the land passed through a long age of suffering and hardship, because it's kind of hard to get by when no grass grows, there are no leaves on the trees, no water in the rivers. It was ugly. So then, after this long and difficult age, Arthur becomes king of the land of Logres, and every brave and gentle knight in all the world came riding to become a knight of his round table. And they all heard about this whole thing, and they said, they swore with a single intention they were going to go out there, they were going to, if the maidens had left heirs, they would restore the wells, they would restore the maidens to their place, they would vanquish the heirs of the evil Amangons, etc., and put everything right again. So they all went out on these quests, trying to find the maidens. And what they found was, all through the wilderness, you would find a maiden and a knight, okay, and you would have to joust with the knight and defeat the knight. And it turned out that the maidens and the knights were all descended from maidens who had been raped by Amangons and his vassals. So they were descended from both sides of that old quarrel. And if you vanquished the knights, you could send, in the typical way of the time, you could send them back to Camelot, where they tell the story and all this kind of stuff. And so various things happened, and it gets long and complex. But eventually, Arthur reduced the whole world to peace, and everything was fine. And the wasteland was made green again. And this all ties up with the court of the rich fisher, aka the Fisher King, who which could not be found anymore once Amangons raped the maiden of the well. Okay, so now Gematria, we have fun. Most people these days in the Western world tend to think of Gematria in terms of Hebrew Gematria, because that's the kind that the Golden Dawn made famous. But there is also Greek Gematria. Every Greek letter also equals a number. And since Koine Greek was the standard language of the Gnostics, I figured that was the Gematria I needed to look into. And as soon as I did that, I started hitting pay dirt. So first of all, I gave a shot to the name Bleheris. Bleheris was the first of those knights with the maidens that had to be vanquished and sent back to Camelot. He was also a historical person, and he's referred to in a number of the Old Grail legends. Bleheris works out to the number 352 in Greek mythology. Now, as you may know, in Gematria, you can always add or subtract 1 from any number without changing its meaning. So 352 is the number of Hehodos, the way, and Hobios, the life. Think of the way, the truth, and the life. There's a reference to Jesus there. Subtract 1, you get Hogoes, the wizard. Add 1, you get Hermes. So we have this messenger, this wizard, this source of magic, who is in some sense the way and the life, and is Hermes Trismegistus.
Yes.
His other name, the other name of Bleheris, is Blihos, and that works out to 312. That's Angelos, messenger, Hermes again. So there's a lot of stuff there. That's one example. Amangons works out to 1145. That works out to 2 different Greek phrases. Hikathedra de tes basileas geis, the throne of the kingdom of earth. More importantly, Lestis Kores, the despoiler of Kore, the despoiler of Persephone. He's Hades. He's the god of the underworld. Once again, we have a reference here to the Eleusinian mysteries. Grail in medieval French, works out to 135, which is the number of doxa, teaching. And subtract 1, you got agion, holy thing. There's more. There's much more. I went through a fairly simple Gematria analysis, and it's very clear that the elucidation in particular was structured according to Gematria. It has a whole series of names that can be unpacked using that very standard tool of esoteric traditions at that time. So it's clear to me that what we've got going on here is that this I think shows very clearly that what was going on with the Grail legends was not just a bunch of folk tales that were sort of hyped up for mass market consumption in the media markets at the time. It was as occultists and mystics have been saying all along. It had a very definite, very straightforward spiritual interpretation, which is supported by the Gematria and which is shown by all of these numerical equivalencies.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I feel like when I read that, I felt somehow my intuition and the feelings that I had about the whole Grail mythos for years were somehow validated. I know they don't need to be validated in that way, but it was kind of nice to have you do that.
The thing is, I had the same reaction.
Mm-hmm.
I was going, what if I try? Because I've had access to the elucidation for a long time. I got a photocopy of it years ago. Photocopied it from a book I got in interlibrary loan, and then, I mean, at this point, I'm sufficiently knowledgeable in French that I was able to do my own translation of it. But so I was working with the elucidation. I thought about, what about, it won't be Hebrew Gematria. It'll be Greek. What if I try Greek Gematria? And the numbers started coming out. I was going, whoa, okay. I have not been wasting my time.
Definitely not.
So I know the feeling of validation there. The pay dirt, the ting. You got it.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what it is exactly. I feel like it's somehow proof in the realm where proof is accepted that of these things.
Yeah, I mean, Gematria can be a little challenging because, you can, if you're sufficiently clever, argue almost anything into meaning almost anything. But this is pretty straightforward, where you take these numbers and look at them and go, yeah, that means what it means.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly didn't get the sense like you were at all even remotely doing anything of like the Kenneth Grant sort of thing. So it was very straightforward. I felt it was absolutely clear.
Grant is fun, but I think he's a great demonstration of what you can do with Gematria if you really want to.
Yes.
But yeah, I found that whole thing very striking, and then to end up going into Jessie Weston's work and going into the work of some of the other scholars of that time, and finding that they had actually pieced together much of this material that I hadn't even known. Yeah, I mean, I'd read a lot, but I was able. These days, it's much easier to get things via online archives than it was the last time I really soaked myself in Grail legend. When you didn't have the online archives, you had to rely on interlibrary alone and what you could get. And so I was just saying, okay, so Jessie Weston and several of the other people got the connection to the mysteries. They got the connection to Gnosticism. They got the link to the Knights Templar. All of these pieces, they came, well, possibly much closer than anyone realizes, because Weston certainly seems to have had connection with a group in the early 20th century that was practicing, that was actually enacting the Grail ritual itself.
Wow.
Well, John, I know you're an incredibly prolific writer. You're always working on multiple projects. I always admire your work ethic so much. It's really incredible. Can you tell us about any new projects on your horizon?
Let's see. What do we got? What do we got coming out now? I actually have a mid-sized flurry of books in process right now. One of my occult teachers, the late John Gilbert, passed away in 2020, in the early 2021. He left a bunch of manuscript behind him, and there are two works of his, one on tarot, one on the Tree of Life, that I have edited, and those will be out in this coming year. The Doors of Tarot and the Tree of Vision, I think, is the title of the other one. Don't quote me on that latter, but yeah, that's taken a bunch of work. I'm again doing a bunch of fiction. I had ended up my set of Lovecraftian novels, or para-Lovecraftian novels, is coming out from a new publisher in this next year, or no, it's in this year now. And also the first of a new series of occult mysteries that I want to do, sort of have fun in the mystery genre, and also involve one of the things that irritates me about so many works of occult fiction is that they don't use real magic. It's all, fantasy, Harry Potter crap. Yeah. And so I'm doing a set of occult mysteries where all the magic is stuff that people can actually practice.
That's excellent.
Things that occultists actually do here and now. And it makes for some very good stories. So there's that. Let's see. The sequel to I've got several series projects going on now, so it makes life complex. I have The Way of the Golden Section was the first volume in a series of books on occult instruction, basically a set of training manuals, and work with my oracle deck, the Sacred Geometry Oracle. And the second of the instructional books in that series, The Way of the Four Elements, that's going to be coming out in the not-too-distant future. A new edition of my book, A World Full of Gods, An Inquiry into Polytheism, will be out fairly soon, and my commentary on The Cosmic Doctrine by Dion Fortune. So yeah, there's a bunch of stuff that's kind of piled up, and it'll all be out in the months immediately ahead.
Wow.
Yeah. That's a lot.
Well, I've been going through kind of a slow period. The last 2 years, I didn't have many books out. It was a complicated time. I was involved in a change of publishers, and there were some things that had to get finished, and it's one of those things.
That is awesome. I look forward to all of that. That is great.
I'm glad to hear it.
Oh, thank you.
I hope you enjoy them.
Well, you're a wonderful writer, and it's a really pleasure to speak with you. I appreciate you spending time with us and talking about your work. It's just awesome.
I'm happy to do so. As I've mentioned, it's free publicity for me and my books. What's not to like?
Yeah, I think Billy and I have talked numerous times about how much we're looking forward to reading this, how much we enjoy reading the book, how much we're looking forward to talking with you about it, and I mean, just felt like a momentous occasion. The whole thing.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I've been wrong before, but I think this book may make a little more of a difference than some of mine. I'm not sure. We'll see.
I think
It's one
so.
of those intuitive things. I hope so.
This book, I mean, was definitely my absolute favorite of yours. It just reignited my passion about the subject of the Grail. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, totally.
You're very welcome. I'm delighted to hear that.
In the Chamber of Reflection and at our Patreon, Billy and I continue the interview with John Michael Greer in part 2, where he expounds upon the origins of Freemasonry and connections to ancient religion, discusses the ceremony of the Grail, and much more. Join us for that compelling conversation. And I'd like to remind you that although you're able to listen to this podcast at no charge, it costs time and money to create. We ask you to support our efforts and the creation of future podcasts by joining the membership section at chamberofreflection.com or subscribing via Patreon at patreon.com/occultapersonality. As always, if you're already supporting the show or have done so in the past, my heartfelt thanks, and I salute you. And please remember, we're in the midst of our Meditations on the Tarot Study Circle that is open to all Chamber of Reflection paid members. Later in February, we're meeting to discuss the Hanged Man, and you should join us.